This comment says, Hebrew wasn't a dead language. And the next one says, actually, Hebrew wasn't a dead language and was spoken in Israel, just not out of Israel. So places like Europe thought it was dead. Okay, these people are responding to a video in which I said, in passing, that Hebrew was dead as a spoken language for a long time. But I also said that it was not an extinct language, and that's an important distinction. A dead language simply means that it's not a living language. A living language is a language with native speakers that is passed down as a spoken native language from one generation to the next, and that any innovations in the language are passed down as well, so the language gradually evolves over time in its spoken form. Hebrew ceased to be in that situation. It ceased to be a living language when it had no more native speakers. But people don't like that term dead language because it sounds like the language is now useless. But of course, it was not useless at all. It was used in many ways. So it wasn't extinct. An extinct language would be a language with no more use cases. A dead language can still be used in many different ways, like Hebrew was. It was still used extensively in religious ritual, in religious writing, and in literature, and in correspondence as well. And it was also used as a lingua franca to some extent by members of Jewish communities from around the world. So if a Jewish merchant from Morocco met a customer from Europe and they didn't have a common language, they might use Hebrew. They might take their knowledge of written Hebrew and their knowledge of liturgical Hebrew and try to put together a conversation in a simplified form of Hebrew. So there are written accounts of that sort of use of Hebrew throughout the ages. And it's also quite well known that at least in the 19th century, in Jerusalem, the Jews of different linguistic backgrounds would often use Hebrew as a way to communicate with each other as a lingua franca. Now, it was probably a simplified and limited form of Hebrew because it wasn't a native language used for all aspects of life, but they were using their knowledge of written Hebrew to communicate to some extent when necessary. I want to share with you an excerpt of a book called A Social History of Hebrew and Its Origins by William Schniedewind, in which he says that Hebrew basically ceased to be a living language around 200 CE. It was an end for Hebrew, but it was also a new beginning for the Hebrew language. The revolts against Rome resulted in the displacement of the Hebrew speech communities of Roman Palestine. With the displacement of most Hebrew speakers, vernacular Hebrew waned. In a manner of speaking, this was the end of Hebrew as a living language. Yet this was not the end of the Hebrew language. Hebrew continued as a secondary vernacular among disparate Jewish communities, as well as continuing as a religious and literary language. Okay, so that's really what I'm talking about. It was the end of Hebrew as a living native spoken language, but it continued to be used as a religious, literary, and cultural language, and also as a lingua franca, as he says in the book, a secondary vernacular.